History often remembers Jane Seymour as Henry VIII's quiet, obedient wife, the gentle queen who gave England its long-awaited heir. But hidden beneath that polished image lies a truth almost no one speaks of. Jane entered a court still dripping with the fear, paranoia, and brutality that had consumed Anne Boleyn, and she stepped dangerously close to a secret Henry guarded more fiercely than any crown. What she discovered was not supernatural, but something far more terrifying: the king's private truth. In the summer of 1536, Jane Seymour entered Henry VIII's court, not as a triumphant bride, but as a quiet witness stepping directly into the aftermath of a queen's destruction. Only weeks had passed since Anne Boleyn's execution, yet her presence still clung to every corridor like a whisper caught in the stone. The palace breathed uneasily. Servants moved with the precision of soldiers marching through a battlefield, careful not to speak too loudly or linger too long near any doorway. Ministers, usually animated with political ambition, lowered their voices whenever the king's name was uttered. It was as though the air itself had learned fear. Jane sensed immediately that this was no ordinary royal household. Her upbringing in Wolf Hall had not prepared her for the psychological pressure embedded in Whitehall's walls. She walked with a queen's grace, yet felt like an intruder, a replacement stitched hastily into place over the torn fabric of Henry's previous marriage. Some courtiers bowed with exaggerated courtesy, attempting to prove loyalty to the new regime. Others barely concealed their apprehension, unsure whether the king's favor for Jane would endure longer than the season. Everyone remembered how quickly affection had soured for Anne, but there was something else, something unspoken yet deeply embedded in the behavior of those around her. Jane noticed that whenever Henry rose from table or dismissed his council early, the atmosphere shifted. His absence triggered a subtle collective tension. He often disappeared for hours, sometimes entire nights, moving through the palace in a manner that suggested both purpose and secrecy. When Jane politely inquired about these nocturnal wanderings, the attendants stiffened. They offered vague answers, their eyes drifting toward the floor rather than meeting hers. In her early days as queen, Jane learned that certain topics were not meant to be questioned. At the top of that unspoken list was the king's private habits, especially those concerning a locked door located deep within the older, less traveled wing of the palace. Though no one dared describe it openly, Jane heard the whispers carried by anxious maids, a chamber no queen had ever entered, a place Henry visited alone, a room known only in murmurs as the king's hidden space. The phrases differed, but the fear behind them was unmistakable. Jane tried to dismiss these notions as court gossip, the sort of embellished rumor that festered whenever a monarch's actions remained obscured. Yet the tension she felt each time Henry vanished did not resemble idle speculation. The silence was too rehearsed, the avoidance too deliberate. It was as if the palace lived under an unbreakable rule: ask nothing and survive. Still, Jane could not ignore the heavy sense of judgment that seemed embedded within the stone walls. They bore witness to the downfall of queens, ministers, and countless unnamed servants, casualties of displeasing a king who wielded cruelty with unsettling ease. Jane recognized that stepping into this marriage meant stepping into the shadow of all who had been destroyed before her, and as she walked past the forbidden corridor for the first time, she felt something colder than fear settle within her. It was the understanding that Henry loved obedience, but he loved secrets even more. In her first weeks as queen, Jane Seymour learned to navigate Whitehall Palace with cautious grace. She moved through its endless passages, noting the contrast between its outward magnificence and the quiet dread embedded within its lesser-traveled corridors. Whitehall was not only a place of ceremony, it was a maze of histories, concealed rooms, and memories of decisions made behind closed doors. And within that vast network of stone lay a wing Jane soon sensed she was never meant to walk. Henry's disappearances began as curiosities, brief absences explained away by the council as moments of rest or private prayer. But Jane observed patterns where others pretended not to see them. The king vanished most frequently after receiving troubling diplomatic reports or when quarrels erupted among his advisors. No guard accompanied him. No attendant helped him walk, despite the worsening condition of his leg. He moved alone, slipping into that shadowed wing like a man entering a sanctuary meant only for himself. Servants avoided the area entirely. Jane noticed how maids redirected their routes, how stewards paused mid-step at the sight of its archway, and how foreign envoys instinctively kept their distance. Even the palace dogs refused to linger there, choosing instead to follow attendants through busier, safer halls. Something about that forgotten wing created a silence unnaturally heavy, not supernatural, but shaped by fear, secrecy, and memory. When Jane finally questioned one of the older chamberlains about it, his reaction revealed more than any explanation could have. He paled, bowed deeply, and muttered, "Your Majesty, that part of the palace is not used." His voice wavered on the last word, making it painfully clear that "not used" meant not spoken of. He quickly excused himself, leaving Jane with the sense that she had touched an invisible boundary others had spent years learning to avoid. From fragments pieced together through overheard conversations and cautious hints from her ladies-in-waiting, Jane learned that the wing had been constructed under Henry VII. It once served as a site for private hearings, interrogations, and judgments delivered without public record. Catherine of Aragon had been advised to keep her distance from it early in her marriage. Anne Boleyn, spirited and curious by nature, had occasionally asked questions about its purpose, questions that had been met with warnings from her closest attendants. Jane never heard anyone speak its true name. Instead, the palace referred to it in vague, chilling terms: the king's private space, the old chamber, the concealed rooms. Yet one whispered phrase carried through the palace like a forbidden prayer: the chamber without a name. It was uttered only by those brave enough to speak of it at all, and always in hushed tones, as though they feared the stone walls might repeat their words. The deeper Jane looked into the palace's unrecorded history, the more she noticed small inconsistencies. A guard stationed where no patrol was needed, a set of keys tucked into a steward's sleeve with nervous precision, the recent repair of a wooden door that servants swore had not been touched in years. Everything suggested that Henry still used the space, and that its purpose had not softened with time. Yet Jane's curiosity, though growing, was measured by fear. She understood the Queen survived Henry not through knowledge, but through silence. And somewhere behind that silence lay the reason no one dared follow Henry into the darkness of that forgotten corridor. Still, the question took hold of her. What could a king need so desperately to hide? Jane Seymour's first tangible clue arrived not through gossip or accident, but through a small moment of curiosity she could not suppress. One quiet morning, while waiting for the council to finish advising Henry, she wandered into a seldom-used study adjoining her private apartments. The room smelled of parchment, dust, and long-abandoned administrative work. It was a place overlooked by most attendants, the sort of space that still held remnants from queens who had lived and vanished within these same walls. A wooden desk stood near the window, its drawers warped from age. Jane opened them absent-mindedly, expecting nothing more than forgotten quills or scraps of parchment. Instead, in the farthest drawer, stuck at first, then pulled free with effort, she found a torn page folded 3 times, the edges curled like something hidden in haste. The handwriting struck her immediately. It was neat, firm, and unmistakably clerical, the script of someone accustomed to writing for the crown. At the top of the page, in red ink, stood a single chilling word: offenders. Below it lay a list of names. They were not nobles, nor men whose political downfalls had echoed across England. They were ordinary people: a scribe who incorrectly copied a diplomatic letter, a stable hand accused of overhearing a private dispute, a laundress who misplaced a garment belonging to a foreign envoy. Next to each name was a short phrase describing a consequence: confinement, removal, reassignment, absence without record. The last phrase appeared more than once, and Jane understood immediately what it implied. None of these entries existed in official documents. Jane had seen enough registers to recognize what should have been recorded and what had been deliberately concealed. What disturbed her most were the dates. Some coincided with the exact nights Henry slipped into the forbidden wing, Others were written only days before Anne Boleyn's final arrest. Her breath tightened as she considered the implications. This was not a record of lawful punishments managed by the council or the courts. It was a private system, hidden from Parliament, shielded from ambassadors, unknown even to senior advisors. It was a system controlled solely by Henry. Jane folded the page carefully and hid it within her sleeve, just as footsteps echoed outside the study. Later, in the privacy of her chamber, she read the document again. Each line grew heavier, suggesting a pattern she could no longer ignore. Henry removed not just political rivals, but anyone who came too close to truths he wanted buried. The ledger page troubled her sleep. She woke at night, imagining the faces of the people listed, wondering whether their families still searched for them or had accepted their disappearance as one of the many unexplained tragedies that seemed to surround the Tudor crown. The idea that these punishments might be connected to the chamber without a name tightened a knot of dread inside her. For days afterward, she watched Henry more closely. She noted how easily he dismissed minor mistakes, yet how swiftly he turned cold when anyone asked questions of his private evenings. Behind his charm lay a calculating vigilance, a readiness to eliminate threats with a precision that required neither public trials nor political justification. The torn ledger page had exposed something far darker than rumor. It confirmed that the palace's fear was not imagined. It was practiced, documented, and enforced under the king's personal command. And as Jane read the final broken line at the bottom of the page, too smudged to decipher, yet clearly ending with another disappearance, she felt a realization settle deep within her. The Forbidden Chamber was no myth. It was a destination. Jane Seymour had never spoken to Anne Boleyn, yet her presence haunted the palace like a shadow that refused to fade. The servants who had once attended Anne walked with stiff restraint, avoiding eye contact as though their memories were liabilities. Jane soon realized that the fear surrounding Anne's downfall was not rooted solely in politics or court gossip. Something deeper lingered beneath the tragedy. Something tied to the very secret Jane now sensed pulsing beneath Whitehall's stone floors. The truth began emerging through whispered confidences shared reluctantly by ladies-in-waiting who had served both queens. They spoke with trembling hesitation, as though each recollection carried danger. From them, Jane learned that, in the final weeks before Anne's arrest, the former queen had become increasingly restless. She questioned Henry's late-night disappearances, challenged his evasive explanations, and once demanded to know why certain servants had disappeared without notice. One attendant, her voice barely audible, revealed the detail that chilled Jane. Anne had once followed Henry into the forbidden wing. The lady did not know how far Anne managed to get, or what she may have seen, but she returned from that night, pale, shaken, and unusually silent. Within days, her relationship with Henry deteriorated with violent speed. The king, who had once moved mountains to marry her, began treating her with cold impatience. Arguments erupted behind closed doors, echoing through the palace with a force that terrified those outside. Jane found further evidence in a stack of abandoned correspondence, letters that Anne had written in haste. Though many were incomplete, fragments revealed a growing fear. In one, Anne referenced a door that should never have been built. In another, she wrote of a truth, black as night, one that even God would struggle to forgive. These were not the thoughts of a confident queen. They were the writings of a woman who had seen something capable of shattering her. The rapid pace of Anne's downfall now held a different weight. Jane had long known of the fabricated charges, adultery, treason, incest, accusations designed to eliminate Anne swiftly and completely. But understanding the possibility that Anne had confronted Henry about the Forbidden Chamber changed everything. It added a chilling dimension to her execution, not merely political necessity, but personal threat. Henry did not tolerate those who trespassed into the darkest corners of his power. Jane pieced together that the night before Anne's arrest had been marked by an explosive argument. Several guards reported hearing the king's voice, raised in fury, followed by the sound of something crashing against the floor. Those witnesses disappeared shortly thereafter, whether reassigned or erased entirely. Their silence formed a hollow frame around the tragedy that followed. A trial rushed through with ruthless efficiency, verdicts decided before evidence was gathered, and an execution that cleared the path for a new marriage within days. For Jane, the realization was sobering. Becoming queen had not positioned her above danger. It had placed her directly beside a man who eliminated threats with precision, even if the threat shared his table, his bed, or his crown. Anne's final weeks were a warning carved into history. Curiosity in Henry's world was a fatal flaw. As Jane folded the fragments of Anne's letters back into their box, she understood that stepping too close to the truth carried consequences she could not ignore. And somewhere behind that locked door, the one Anne had tried to open, waited the reason Henry killed without hesitation. The first sign that something was wrong with the palace's forbidden wing came in the form of a small brass key, one Jane found on the floor near the stairwell leading toward the sealed corridor. It was nothing remarkable at first glance, but its teeth were jagged, uneven, handmade. Not one of the finely cut keys used for the king's official chambers. Someone had dropped it in haste. Jane slipped it into her sleeve before anyone noticed. As queen, she moved through Whitehall with a calm, measured grace, yet beneath her composed exterior simmered a growing awareness of the building's oddities. There were cleaners who avoided entire sections during their nightly duties, guards who stiffened visibly whenever she walked too close to the eastern wing, and workers who suddenly vanished from service after speaking too freely. The palace was full of contradictions and hurried repairs, cracks plastered over without explanation, scorch marks on stone lintels, fresh boards nailed where none had been needed before. One painting in particular caught Jane's attention. It had hung for decades, according to an elderly servant, a grand portrait of Henry's lineage depicting kings and conquerors in full regalia. Now it was gone, removed under the pretense of restoration. In its place remained a stark, rectangular patch on the wall, slightly darker than the surrounding plaster. Jane traced its outline with her fingertips and felt the faint impression of hinges beneath. A door had once been there. Her curiosity deepened. The inconsistencies multiplied. Workers Jane questioned about the painting's removal stumbled through their responses, speaking in vague, practiced sentences. One young carpenter trembled so badly he could barely hold his tools. She dismissed him gently, but she watched him hurry away, terrified even after being released from her presence. The more Jane observed, the more the palace seemed like a living organism, one with arteries she was not meant to enter and memories it tried desperately to hide. Through discreet inquiries and fragments of overheard conversations, she pieced together the testimonies of former staff. They described sounds from within the forbidden corridor that defied simple explanation. Not supernatural, not fantastical, but unmistakably human, crying muffled behind thick walls. Metal striking stone in rhythmic patterns. And on at least 2 occasions, a voice they swore belonged to the king himself, low, deliberate, issuing commands with chilling calm. Jane felt her stomach twist each time she considered it. Henry, pacing a shadowed room, speaking not to counselors or advisors, but to someone held out of sight. Perhaps several someones. The palace had always whispered of Henry's unpredictability, but Jane had believed, as many did, that his temper came from illness or pressure or the burden of kingship. Yet the more she uncovered, the more she realized that his brutality was not the result of circumstance. It was part of him. A piece he hid with elaborate care. Each revelation tightened the knot of fear that lived in her chest. Still, she continued, quietly, carefully. She moved through the palace like a ghost, noting which doors had been repainted too recently, which keys servants tucked away the moment she approached, which guards bristled when she lingered near the sealed wing. The brass key she had found seemed to hum with relevance, though she still did not know which lock it belonged to. Her emotions wavered between dread and duty. Some nights she felt almost paralyzed by fear. Fear of what she might uncover, fear of what it meant for her marriage, fear of becoming another name struck from the record like the attendants who had known too much. Yet she also sensed the weight of her position. As queen, she held a responsibility to understand the man whose son she hoped soon to bear. Not merely for herself, but for the future king. The balance within her was delicate: compassion for Henry's suffering, sorrow for the man behind the crown, and tightening terror at the brutality he concealed from the world. One evening, as she stood near the sealed corridor, a guard approached her abruptly, his expression strained, voice tight. "This wing is not safe, Your Majesty," he said. "Repairs, unstable floors, His Majesty forbids anyone from entering." Jane met his gaze, her tone soft yet steady. "I am the king's wife. I go where I must." The guard's face blanched. For the first time, Jane understood the depth of the fear Henry inspired, not through decrees or punishments, but through secrets. Secrets that seep through the palace walls like cold air from a crypt. And at the end of that corridor, behind one of those countless hidden doors, waited the truth she was inching toward with every step. The entrance to the chamber revealed itself not through luck, but through persistence. After weeks of tracing the palace's forgotten architecture, Jane stood alone before a wall of tapestries depicting the triumphs of the Tudor line. Their woven colors were frayed from years of smoke and candle soot. But behind one tapestry, Jane felt the faint draft of hidden space brushing her fingertips. She lifted the heavy fabric and found the outline of a narrow door, wood aged to a deep, uneven gray. The lock was thick, crude, and old, not the sort of mechanism used for royal apartments. It looked more suited to a storeroom in a fortress. When Jane tried the brass key she had hidden for weeks, it turned with unsettling ease, as though the lock had been waiting for her. She listened before pushing the door open. Silence. No movement, no voices, only the muted hum of wind threading through unseen cracks. Henry had been carried to his chambers earlier, after his leg gave way beneath him. He would be heavily medicated by now, surrounded by attendants. This was her only chance. Jane stepped inside. The room was larger than she expected. Long, rectangular, its stone walls bare except for iron rings affixed in even intervals. Dust hovered in the air like fine ash. No torches burned. She carried a small lantern, its trembling flame casting distorted shadows across the floor. There were no monstrous horrors here, no unspeakable creatures of imagination. The chamber's terror lay in its clarity. A wooden table stood against the far wall. On it were records, names, dates, confessions inked in shaky handwriting. Jane recognized several. Minor courtiers who had vanished quietly. A foreign messenger whose disappearance had sparked rumors but no inquiry. The brother of a disgraced lady in waiting. Their final words, written under duress, stared back at her in uneven lines. Beside the table sat tools, some broken, some rusted. Not instruments of theatrical torture, but recognizable devices used to restrain or hold a person steady during questioning. These were the implements of a man who believed himself justified in extracting truth through fear. Jane's breath caught when she noticed smaller, intimate items. A child's wooden toy, its head snapped from its body. A tarnished ring bent out of shape, engraved with the initials of a minor noble she remembered hearing about in passing. An embroidered sash in foreign colors, still smelling faintly of incense and travel. These were personal remnants of people who had entered this room alive and left erased. She placed her hand on one of the iron rings embedded in the wall. It was cold, solid, and worn from years of use. Henry had not relied solely on his counsel or interrogators. He had taken part in the questioning himself. His presence was still here, in the scuffed stones, in the harshly written notes, in the eerie precision of the room's arrangement. Jane stood still for several moments, absorbing the weight of what surrounded her. She did not feel hatred. She felt something far more complicated. The crushing realization that the man she now shared her life with had shaped this chamber with purpose. It was not the excess of a tyrant drunk on power. It was the refuge of a man who believed cruelty was the only safeguard against betrayal. This room was Henry's private judgment hall. When Jane finally stepped back, she noticed something else, a second keyhole hidden beneath the table. One she could not access, one that suggested the chamber extended further. She extinguished her lantern, slipped out, and sealed the door behind her, but she knew Henry would sense that something had shifted. Henry noticed it within hours. The key to the chamber, his private vault of judgment, his deepest refuge, had been nudged from its usual angle. Not removed, not blatantly disturbed, but shifted by the faintest degree. A detail so small most men would overlook it. But Henry was not most men. He was a king who lived with the constant sting of unseen threats, the echo of whispered treason, and the memory of wives who had disappointed him or dared to challenge his authority. He exploded with suspicion. Before sunset, he summoned the guards assigned to the West Wing. The men entered trembling, fully aware that any incorrect answer, any hesitation, might seal their fate. Henry questioned them with a sharpness that reminded Jane of his days as a younger king. The quick intellect, the ability to read a man's fear, the cold calculation of a ruler who believed himself chosen by God, yet betrayed by everyone else. When the men insisted they had seen no intruder, Henry dismissed them, then ordered their immediate removal from court. Their families were sent away. Their rooms ransacked, their belongings burned. And still, Henry paced. Jane watched these events unfold with a calm facade that cost her every ounce of strength. She had wiped the dust from her shoes and washed her hands repeatedly, yet her skin still felt stained by the chamber's cold, silent truths. Every time Henry entered a room, her heart seized, not from guilt, but from the certainty that his paranoia would eventually lead him close to the truth. His leg ulcer worsened as his rage deepened. The festering wound, long in affliction, now became the physical manifestation of his spiraling fear. The physicians tried to soothe him, but Henry struck one across the face when he suggested rest. "Rest?" Henry growled. "When traitors creep through my walls." The entire palace moved as if under siege. Servants walked softer. Courtiers avoided the king's gaze. Jane's ladies-in-waiting whispered cautiously, aware that a single misjudged comment could result in disappearance. The oppressive tension that had once merely lingered now pressed upon every corner of Whitehall Palace like a storm refusing to break. Yet Henry never accused Jane. He watched her, studied her, but never voiced suspicion. Perhaps he convinced himself his gentle, obedient queen lacked the imagination to seek hidden answers. Perhaps he feared what it would mean if she had, or perhaps, somewhere beneath the armor of kingship, he still clung to the fragile hope that Jane represented purity and forgiveness in a life dripping with betrayal. But she could see it, the mask slipping crack by crack. One night he confided in her, not out of trust but out of desperation. "I built that chamber," he whispered as though admitting a sin, "because no man can rule without fear. Fear keeps truth close. Fear keeps nations loyal." Jane nodded, though the logic chilled her. He continued, voice low and uneven. "People speak of justice as if it were a clean thing. But justice is carved from blood and secrets. You do not understand what it means to hold a kingdom together." Jane's silence was her shield. As Henry spoke, she felt the enormity of what she had uncovered. The chamber was not merely a remnant of cruelty. It was where Henry fought the shadows that pursued him. Every judgment he carved into that stone room was a battle against the terror of losing control. A terror that had grown louder since Anne Boleyn's downfall, since rebellion in the north, since the crushing weight of ruling a nation alone. He was unraveling, and Jane, the only living witness to the truth behind the tapestries, understood she stood on a tightening rope where one wrong breath could send her into the darkness Henry had carved for others. Jane understood that knowledge, in Henry's court, was more dangerous than treason itself. After entering the forbidden chamber, she realized that silence was not merely survival, it was strategy. She would never mention the chamber, never hint that she had touched the stone still bearing the weight of unspoken judgments, but silence carried its own burden. It settled on her shoulders like a cloak woven from fear and duty. The court noticed subtle changes in her. She moved more cautiously, spoke with measured calm, and watched Henry not as a wife watches a husband, but as a wary observer studies a volatile ruler. Her face remained serene, but her eyes reflected the cost of holding a truth that could destroy her. Henry, for his part, shifted as well. His suspicion diffused, but not because he felt safe, rather because he could not decide where to direct his fear. The chamber remained sealed. Its key moved to a different place each night. He ordered guards rotated unpredictably. He sent for carpenters at odd hours to reinforce the walls. Any sign of wear, any unfamiliar sound became a new reason for alarm. Jane watched him closely. She recognized that the chamber was his private battlefield, a place where he tore at the shadows haunting him. But now those shadows seemed to pursue him even in daylight. His ulcered leg throbbed constantly, and the physician's attempts to ease it only fueled his fury. Jane remained at his side during these moments, offering quiet words, carefully chosen to soothe him without drawing attention. Yet behind that gentle presentation, she made choices that carried great risk. She began removing certain attendants from proximity to Henry Young pages, frightened scribes, servants whose trembling hands were too easily interpreted as guilt. Jane recommended they be reassigned to different wings or sent to the households of noblewomen she trusted. Henry noticed none of these subtle shifts, for the Queen framed her suggestions as concerns for efficiency or comfort. Only those closest to her understood that she was sheltering them from the King's growing volatility. But with every life she redirected, suspicion edged closer. A few counselors whispered that the Queen interfered too frequently. Some believed she was becoming soft-hearted, a dangerous trait in a Tudor monarch's household. Others speculated that she was asserting influence beyond her proper role. Jane ignored their murmurs, though she understood the danger they carried. Henry's queens were not permitted personal agendas, not even benevolent ones. The unspoken agreement between Henry and Jane began to form in this tension. She never again touched the tapestries that concealed the entrance to the forbidden chamber. She never asked where the key had been moved. She never questioned the increasingly erratic decisions Henry made in council meetings or the sudden, quiet disappearances of minor officials. In return, Henry did not pry into her silences. He seemed relieved by her compliance, almost comforted by her steadiness. In her presence, he let his voice soften, though the undercurrent of fear never left him. He leaned on her, not as a husband leans on a wife, but as a king clings to the last steady foothold in a world he could no longer control. At night, when the palace finally fell into uneasy quiet, Jane felt the weight of the chamber pressing through the walls. She knew she had stepped into a role no queen before her had survived. She was not Henry's confidant nor his partner. She was the guardian of a secret he would kill to protect. That balance, one woven of silence, duty, and hidden terror, became the fragile foundation of their marriage. And Jane understood that as long as the chamber remained locked, both of their lives depended on her ability to pretend she had never seen it. In the final weeks of her pregnancy, Jane Seymour moved through Whitehall Palace with a quiet heaviness that went far beyond the child she carried. Her body weakened, but her mind remained sharply aware of the tension around her. Henry's unease had returned, subtler than before, but unmistakable. He visited the forbidden chamber more often, though never for long. Each time he emerged, he shut himself away in silence, as if wrestling with an enemy only he could see. Then, without warning, he locked the chamber permanently. The carpenters came at dawn, sworn to secrecy, escorted by guards who refused to meet Jane's eyes. The sound of hammering echoed through the palace corridors, slow, deliberate strikes that felt less like construction and more like burial. The wooden frame was reinforced with iron. A fresh wall of stone was set in place, hiding the door completely. Henry stood watching as though sealing a tomb. When the work was done, he dismissed the men and ordered all tools burned. The palace did not speak of it. They feared even acknowledging that the room had ever existed. Henry told Jane nothing, yet she felt the shift immediately. The chamber had been the place where he exerted his private authority, where he justified cruelty as necessity. Its ceiling suggested not remorse, but fear of discovery. Henry now trusted his walls more than his people. Jane sensed that her time was running thin. Producing an heir had always been her greatest shield. The court whispered as much, even when they tried to praise her kindness. They meant well, but Jane understood the truth. A queen who pleased Henry was safe only until the next threat entered his mind. Once the chamber had been sealed, that threat seemed to move closer. Her ladies-in-waiting often found her awake late into the night, writing, rewriting, and finally burning pages of notes. She had begun drafting a confession, not of guilt, but of truth. A record of everything she had seen inside the forbidden chamber, of the remnants of Henry's justice, of the broken objects left behind by the forgotten. She did not name names or accuse him openly. She merely described what she knew in careful, measured words. The letter was not meant to expose Henry during her lifetime. Jane knew such an act would mean death. It was meant for the future, for someone who might one day understand how fear had shaped a king and how silence had shaped a queen. On the night before her labor began, she completed the letter. She folded it 3 times, sealed it with her signet, and hid it beneath the linens in a locked chest. She told no one, not even her most trusted attendant, yet something in her expression that night suggested she understood it was a final act. She rested her hands on her stomach and whispered a prayer for the child she would soon bring into the world. She prayed he would inherit strength without cruelty, authority without terror. By dawn, labor pains had begun. Henry rushed to her side, his presence overwhelming, as though he feared losing the last person who kept the world steady beneath him. Jane clung to consciousness long enough to hear the announcement that her son, Edward, was born alive and strong. The court rejoiced, believing the king and queen had been blessed. But Jane's body weakened rapidly. Infection set in. Her breaths shortened. The king's triumph turned into dread. 12 days later, she died. After her death, the chest was opened. The letter was gone. Some believed Henry removed it. Others thought it was burned by those wishing to protect the crown, but no trace of it was ever found. And the chamber sealed behind stone and silence remained hidden within Whitehall, its horrors absorbed into the shadows of Tudor history. The queen who had walked into its darkness carried the secret to her grave, leaving only the faintest whisper of what she had seen behind the tapestries of a king's private realm.